Welcome to the Reversion Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony of Westgate. And as many of you know, on this podcast, we uncover the esoteric and dark forces of the modern world to try and better understand how to avoid its influence. And when it comes to the spiritual framework of these modern revolutions in world history, it's impossible to avoid running into a kabbalistic influence to some degree. And so in this episode, I wanted to invite on someone who is now, I would consider a friend of mine, and his name is Will Tucker. And Will, I actually found on YouTube when I was doing research for the work that I've been doing on the article I'm writing. And I was kind of surprised that it was like a newly uploaded video, and he was covering all this stuff that I had been deep into the research of. And I found that he was on Substack as well, and I was like, oh, that's awesome. Went to check him out and found that he also subscribes to my Substack. So I was like, I got to reach out to this guy and get him on a podcast so we can chat about this stuff, because I don't know anyone else who is as deeply involved in this kind of research. So I'm glad to have him on. I believe he's been doing this a lot longer than I have, and he's very knowledgeable on the subject of Kabbalah, Freemasonry, Jewish Messianism, and he's a writer here on Substack under Analogia Entis and on YouTube. So I'll turn it over to Will here, let him introduce himself and tell us a little more about his work.
Thanks so much, Anthony. It's a real pleasure to be here. I first learned of your work from my Telegram page. One of my subscribers posted your recent article on Kabbalah and the Protestant Revolution. I was really blown away. I'm actually preparing for an upcoming presentation on colonial America and kabbalistic influences in the founding of the U.S. And I find there's a lot of common research that you're doing here, and I'm probably going to be citing you. And it's really helped me connect some dots. This article, at least the portion of it I've read so far. So I really want to applaud the work that you're doing, and really look forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, me too. And yeah, I'm kind of a little disappointed that I can't say the same, because I found you as I was kind of wrapping up all the research that I've been doing. But from the videos I've seen of you, you were kind of like confirming everything that I had found in my research. So I was really happy to see that. And you definitely have a broader knowledge base on this subject. So I'm really interested in hearing some more of the some of the things that I that I didn't encounter yet, possibly. But yeah, so in this episode, we'll be going over that there's so much to cover, and we only have like about an hour or so here, and what we're really talking about is about a 500-year span of history that goes very deep and has many rabbit holes. And I found actually that is the primary challenge in this work is focusing it on something that's a little more direct, like because there's so many different avenues that this goes down. But I'll kind of just throw some questions your way so we can frame this conversation. First of all, what got you interested in Kabbalah and Western esotericism?
So my background is in art. In my 20s, I was in academia teaching contemporary art. And this was in the first decade of the 2000s. So, around the time I graduated high school was 9/11, and then we had the economic crisis of 2009, and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think it was in 2013 was when I've kind of had my great rabbit hole moment where I watched my first 9/11 documentary, conspiracy documentary, and Yeah, I think it was because of the revelation of the domestic spying program, and I think that was something that just totally shattered my paradigm that the government, the intelligence agencies would just take the initiative to spy on, cell phone, internet, and just like the invasion of privacy in the sense of like Big Brother and lack of security. Meanwhile, there's still terrorism happening all over the place. So it's like, what is the real motive here? And that got me thinking, like maybe there's something to conspiracy theory, which was foreboding, especially in academia, beforehand for me. And so I watched one of these 9/11 documentaries, and then I have my grandfathers were both Freemasons, and I'm from Kentucky, and I grew up a Protestant in the Christian church denomination. I think it's called the Independent Christian Church. That's like the Church of Christ. It was created during the Stone Campbell movement in the mid 19th century, around the time of like the Mormons and many, like the Seventh-day Adventists and other sort of millenarian Protestant sects. But anyway, so I started looking into Freemasonry and its origins and its, esoteric mission and its influence in America. And you can't study that stuff very, very long until you start running into, Jewish messianism and Kabbalah. So, that's kind of how I got there. And then, Hermeticism as well. And I converted to Roman Catholicism in 2022, and sort of looking at the historical sort of enmity between Judaism, Freemasonry, and the Roman Catholic Church is something that's like, it's understanding that conflict has allowed me to kind of understand like how Judaism seeks to sort of erect its own New World Order over top of Christendom.
That is very similar to my story as well. I found, I came to Orthodoxy around 2020, and I actually found that one of the driving factors was this knowledge that I had over the years of just being in, conspiracy world, and seeing that all of these forces they all have a common enemy. It's the church, it's Christendom, and so in a weird way, it was kind of like the inverse confirmed the truth of Christianity to me. So that was, that's it wasn't as much like all these apologetics and, reading the church fathers. That certainly was a big part of it. But I think the most effective thing was just starting to take notice of these patterns that you see throughout all these revolutions that are fundamentally anti-Christian. But so let me ask you this. Why would you say it's important for Christians to understand this very esoteric Jewish mystical text?
I think that, particularly within like the post-war epoch, the Holocaust dispensation, as we like to call it, it's exceedingly important to understand how Judaism has sort of overthrown the sovereignty of at least the temporal sovereignty of the Christian world, and it's done so through a process of Jewish messianic instigation and subversion. And to understand sort of the underlying ethos and metaphysics of that system of messianism, one has to understand, the history of Jewish theosophy and Gnosticism, known as the Kabbalah, which is, a compendium of many generations of texts dating back to, the first centuries, and then sort of the most influential and well-known is the Zohar of the 13th century. But if you study the Kabbalah, it's a kind of hall of mirrors, especially historically. Like, Moses de Leon wrote, and most historians recognize that it was written in the 13th century, the Sefer HaZohar, but it claims to have been written in the 3rd century by Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, who was a rabbi contemporaneous with like Bar Kokhba. They're in the Bar Kokhba revolts, and then it was recorded a century or so later. And anyway, there was a tradition that was going on at that time called the Merkaba Hekelo tradition. Merkaba refers to like the fiery chariot that's mentioned in the book of Ezekiel. And so these rabbis were at that time were involved in a process of speculative gnosis in which they were trying to ascend to the mystical throne room of God in order to extract sort of mystical secrets and knowledge to be applied to their own sort of practice of mysticism. But to get back to your question here, why is it so important for Christians today to understand it, is because it's the methodology of under which our social order is under attack, and our spirit, and because it shares a common origin, because Judaism shares a common heritage, in the Torah and the prophets, and so and because of the prophets, it also shares a common sort of eschatology, but misconstrued, misinterpreted, and like the Christian, like the Puritan, or I'm sorry, the Protestants, the Restorationists and the Primitivists who want to claim that something was lost through the tradition of the church, the magisterium, and that there's the true Christianity is buried deep in the past, and actually the Kabbalah is sort of the hidden connective tissue that connects the Old Testament prophets to the true Christianity. And so that was an idea that was very influential during the Renaissance and Enlightenment period. And
Prisca Theologia.
Yes, exactly. And so, Kabbalah, like I said, it's a hall of mirrors. Sometimes, it was, they refer to it as like the new old tradition. Sometimes it's said to have been given to Moses on Mount Sinai as the secret oral tradition. Sometimes it was given to Joseph in Egypt, sometimes by the angels to Adam in the Garden of Eden. Sometimes it's said to have been the blueprint that God had to abide by in order to bring the world into creation. So, and even like Christian apologists will say there's the forbidden Kabbalah, a Gnostic Kabbalah, but then there's the true Kabbalah, which was given to the Israelite patriarchs, and that's the Kabbalah that we adhere to, and not the the magical one. But anyway, I think it's important to understand how it creates confusion around the first things and the last things, and therefore the messianic kingdom, particularly the millennium, which is something I know we're going to get into today, I think is for Freemasonry and Kabbalah is sort of the epicenter of their messianic activity, and confusing Christians into thinking that the millennium is to come.
Yeah, and what was really kind of eye-opening to me when I started learning about the teachings of the Zohar is this explains so much to me, is the aspect of human action, and how it's a complete inversion of the Christian Genesis narrative. In Kabbalah, I maybe can expound upon this, but this concept of in Lurianic Kabbalah of Tzimtzum, where it's in the creation narrative, God, before he speaks the universe into existence, he takes this inhale, and the inhale is the first creative act that creates the space in which God puts the material world into order. And this is a very prominent concept in Kabbalah, and there was this kind of God essentially in Kabbalah broke creation. The shattering of these vessels, as they're called, that could not contain if I'm explaining this correctly, they just could not contain the light of God's creation, and they shattered. So it was essentially like there was this bug in the creation process that God kind of there was like a big whoopsie, I didn't take that into account. I didn't think that, it would shatter everything. And so it is man's role in the Kabbalah for the restoring of these shattered vessels. And so everything in Kabbalah involves human effort to repair the world. That is the tikkun olam, the repair of the world. That is the goal of Kabbalah. and it all involves human effort and bringing about the messianic kingdom through human effort. So it's total inversion of Christianity, where we're waiting for Christ. His return is on his terms, and everything in Kabbalah involves the human immanentizing of the eschaton, the inevitable bringing about the messianic kingdom through our own efforts. So that is, I think, for me, one of the big things that helped me to understand a lot of this. I mean, this explains why, like Tikkun Olam in particular, explains why you have all these sects in Judaism that are, for example, the Reform Jews who are typically behind all of these progressive movements. They believe that is their way of bringing about Tikkun. I guess one question I have for you is, do you, because of that, because there's all these sects that have different ideas of how to bring about this world repair, do you think that they're all essentially collaborating towards the same goal, regardless of their strategy?
Yes, but it's an odd kind of system because it's a system built upon contradictions. So I think, like I said, it's a hall of mirrors where, we have this illusion that there are these Orthodox Jews and these progressive revolutionary Jews. But actually, the more Orthodox the sect, typically the more invested they are in Messianism and Kabbalah, or if you want to do this along the lines of like Zionism, if you want to say that the mission of Kabbalah and Jewish Messianism is to rebuild the third temple and set up a kingdom in Jerusalem to reign over the whole earth, then the Zionists would be the sort of vanguard of that project. But if you look at groups like the Neturei Karta or the Haredi Satmar, which are ultra-Orthodox groups who believe that the nation of Israel is an apostate nation, because the Jews are not supposed to return to the Holy Land until after the Messiah, the advent of the Messiah. Yet these two groups are, vehemently anti-Christian. They see Christendom in the West as the fulfillment of Edom that must be overthrown and destroyed before the commencing of the Messianic age. So they're no more our friends than the Zionists are. And it would seem like they're sort of at odds with one another. I know both of us are admirers of E. Michael Jones, but I even have seen him before, say that the Neturei Karta are allies against the Zionists, which I think that's a trap of seeing Kabbalah and Messianic Judaism is just about sort of progressive revolutionary movements. It is as much about a and epistemological warfare as it is about the overthrow of institutions. So I think Judaism is a system of interior critique, of contradiction and dialectics, where we within the sort of Western Logos tradition see distinctions and we abide by the law of non-contradiction. Judaism doesn't recognize the law of non-contradiction. Instead, it sees good and evil as being mutually co-determining opposites that are the same by nature of their opposition, if that makes sense. So like you were talking about, Tikkun Olam is the mandate to repair the world, which also happens to be the mandate to repair God. Because since God, within the Lurianic Kabbalah, is totally outside and retracted from creation, the world is his exact opposite. And therefore it is his mirror image, and therefore they are the same. But the Shekinah, the presence of God, is in exile within the world. So through this process of Tikkun, Tikkun Olam is also Tikkun Elohim. It's the repair of the face of God. And once that process is complete, then God will come to know himself, and then the Messianic age will commence. But if you look at the Lurianic creation story, at each step of the way is the kind of contradiction. It's like God is Ein Sof, which means nothingness, yet he's able to retract himself to create a space. And so that space that's left over is the primordial void, the pleroma of non-being, that then is filled with a beam of light, which emanates from Ein So how this non-being can emanate light, is a contradiction, or it comes from nothing. And then there's the Shivarat HaKalim that you referenced, the shattering of the vessels. So somehow within this primordial empty void, there are these Sephiroth, or these vessels that are already prepared within the nothingness to receive this infinite light. And because the light is so charged with the limitless power of Ein Sof, these vessels shatter. And so the resulting world is a chaos and a mixture of the sparks of the divine light, of the infinite, and the shards of the vessels. And so the shards are associated with Edom, the sparks with Israel. And so embedded within everything within the material world is the spark of the infinite, which is the negation of the material world. So in order for the material world to be repaired, it must be brought into balance with its own negation. Yet that infinite light is imperceptible without a veil, the veil being the spark or the shard or the husk. So it's like everything is dialectically entwined with its opposite. And these two things have to be brought into a kind of unity, but that is built upon negation, which is sort of the secret of like what gets called the Hegelian dialectic and summarized as thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but is actually a Lurianic concept, and that Hegel learns through alchemy and through Christian von Rosenroth's the Kabbalah Denudata. But Hegel's dialectic is actually called Offenbung, which is a alchemical term which means sublation, which is a contradictory term. It means to sort of lift up, to preserve, to cancel, and to negate, and to transcend all at the same time. So, like I said before, with Kabbalah, it sort of speaks to mysteries within our cosmology, particularly like the mystery of evil, theodicy, right? What is the origin of evil? If God is all good and all powerful, how can he permit evil to exist in the world? And from whence does evil come? So within like a Thomistic system, we believe that the evil is the privation of the good. It has no being unto itself. It's merely sort of the shadow of the good. But within Kabbalah, evil has its own sort of positive, negativity is its own sort of like the positive being has to have non-being in order for being to exist and for non-being to exist. So like Hegel's equation is rather than thesis, antithesis, synthesis, it's being, non-being, becoming. And so the state of becoming, I think, is like what the Tikkun Olam is really about, is getting the world into this state of sort of perpetual, rather than like being flowing from God, and that creation is fixed, and that there are these sort of eternal types, and Christ is king. It's like, no, there's this state in which the world is constantly sort of evolving and becoming and reaching this eschatological end, but that eschatological end is always sort of beyond our grasp. And so that's where I get to with sort of like what is, you've previously in our notes here asked some questions about like the third temple and the Masonic eschaton, the Masonic temple, and what are those things really about? And some of the recent rabbinic scholars are talking about this idea of like a post-messianic messianism, and also like a secular a secular theism, or a religious atheism, in which God as Ein Sof can be thought of as being nothingness, and therefore. And I think this is the important point that you're trying to get to with like Zimzum and this idea of the kenosis, which you might want to talk about as well. But that in clearing the space and God retracting himself, he gives the world over to itself. So the world is its own sovereignty. God is not the Lord over the world. The world is its own Lord. And so the world has its own duty to become its own messianic fulfillment in this process of becoming God. And in that process, God comes to know himself, and God is completed. Sorry, I know that probably doesn't make any sense, but the system itself doesn't make any sense. So it's important to know that we can't fully summarize it.
It's all dialectical. Yeah. And right. And another interesting aspect of that is in the Zohar, it is man who kicks God out of the garden. So even that is kind of, you know, you see a lot of like this deistic type of entity that they ascribe to God. And there's also a weird kind of polytheistic aspect to it where it's like, okay, is God the Shekinah? Is God the Ein Sof? Like, what, you know, what is God? Like, it's kind of all these different, it's explained as all these different kind of really like symbolic type of entities. But yeah, the kicking of God out of the garden, it's like that is like, I call it the ultimate chutzpah. That is like where you see that whole Jewish chutzpah of like, oh no, it's us that, and you know, there was actually a recent video of Rabbi Shmuley, and he was kind of he was getting all fired up, and he was like, he said something really kind of like this mask off moment where he was like, it's us, like, it's us that control God. He was like, he's like, we are Jews, like we tell God what to do. And it was like, people didn't really pick up on that, but that's Kabbalah. That's from Kabbalah. That is this idea that they have divine command over God. It is us who expelled God from the garden, and it's us who has this duty to restore our union with Shekinah, with this divine feminine goddess, essentially. And you know, that was something that was, again, really eye-opening to me, because that just shows that this whole thing is very it's very humanistic, it's very human-centered, and you can kind of see how it made its way into Renaissance thought, which I think maybe we can get into that. Where do you think this all started? Because in my research, I found there's kind of different takes on this. You can trace it back, you know, as you said, it's kind of not as, it's not dated as old as people perceived it to be in the Renaissance period. But as far as the text itself, these Jewish mystical texts, these Hermetic texts, from what I found in my research, it came from the fall of Constantinople. There was a library that was kind of like archiving all of these esoteric works, and when the Turks sacked Constantinople, it just kind of like opened the floodgates for all this esoteric literature. And then at some point, the Medici banking family bought it up and you know, brought it into classical learning in the Renaissance, which they funded as well. And you know, so some takes say that was the starting point. Some people say it was the Renaissance itself. It was this kind of like syncretism that happened during the Renaissance with Christian Kabbalah, figures like Pico della Mirandola and Johannes Reuchlin. So, you know, and then you have Francis Yates, who kind of attributes the establishment of the esoteric tradition in the West to John Dee and Francis Bacon, those two primary figures. Where I guess what I'm trying to ask is, where do you see this whole thing starting?
I don't know if there is a singular moment, I guess I would say. You know, back up a second. You were talking about kicking God out of the Garden of Eden and the Zohar. And, you know, I read that, you know, I was talking about this Lurianic creation story. And it's posed as an explanation for the origin of evil and of chaos and disorder in the world, right? And of the fall, you know. The fall is sort of the Shevrat HaKalim, the shattering of the vessels, which produces this kind of chaos, the primordial chaos. Judaism rejects the idea of original sin, or at least that we bear the guilt of original sin. So the Garden of Eden, like, where does that fall within this creation story, right? Like, if the fall already takes place prior to the creation of the garden, you know, separations of the, you know, the lands from the waters and all these kinds of things, right? So it you know, the Eden becomes a kind of allegorical space of like this stage in the Lurianic creation in which the Sephiroth are filled with infinite light. And so at that moment, the Sephiroth are composed into the Tree of Life diagram, which is also the sort of the body of the Adam Kadmon, which was the primordial man, and which is he's not really a man, he's an androgyne, right? And so this man is the symbol for this unity with God, this moment before the collapse of the world, and so humanism, sort of esoterically, interpreted, is the reconnection back to this moment, this prelapsarian state, this Edenic state before the fall of man, in which man is perfected and is God, is united with God. So then to answer your second part here about the origins of Kabbalah and its influence, particularly in Christendom in the West, I would say that was certainly a significant moment during the Renaissance, with the Medicis and Pico della Mirandola and Marcello Ficino and Johannes Reuchlin later in Germany. But there's also moments prior to that, even prior to the 11th century, like with figures like Ramon Lull, who's considered a blessed within the Catholic Church. But he was a sort of Renaissance, pre-Renaissance polymath, who sort of prefigured the concept of computer science through his Ars Combinatoria, which is like a kind of number-letter combinatory system of permutations based upon the Sefer Yetzirah. So he was already influenced by the Sefer Yetzirah in like the 9th century, or I'm sorry, the 10th century. And then you have Joachim de Fiore. Have you read much into Joachimism and the Age of the Holy Spirit?
I see his name keep recurring, but I haven't looked too much into his influence.
Yeah, so he was a 3rd century, most like sort of, he's considered like one of the first millenarians, in which he believed that the world was divided into 3 different ages: the age of the Father, which is, the age of the Old Testament; the age of the Son, which is the age of Christ, until the age of Joachim, which was the dawning of the age of the Holy Spirit, in which there would be this sort of collapse of the hierarchy, in which every man would be his own pope and his own priest, and there would be no need for, and it's kind of like a, proto Marxist utopia, in which, the Holy Spirit would be filled in all men and all things, and there would be no need for hierarchy or anything like that, a magisterial tradition. But Joachim was actually influenced by Abraham Abulafia, who was was a Jewish Kabbalist and Messianist, who actually traveled to Rome to try to convert the Pope to his new Kabbalistic syncretic religion. So, like I said, this is in the 13th century. But even before that, if you look at the Gnostics, many of them are Jewish. Marcion, Valentinius, Mani, the pseudo-Clementine sect, which produced the Syzygies, and they're all talking about a kind of what's called like Gnostic dualism, right? But that they're the body in the world, the material world, is totally evil, and the spirit is totally good. You can see how that sort of harsh dualism is worked out dialectically within the Lurianic creation story, right? In which the material world has to be through Tikkun Olam, has to be perfected. The material has to be renewed through the material, through freeing the infinite light that's embedded within the material. But and then where do the Gnostics come from? Like the early, like sort of proto-Kabbalistic texts called the Merkabah and the Hekaloth, that like the later works like the Sefer Yetzirah and the Zohar are referencing stories from those texts, those mystical visions of the rabbis. They're appearing at exactly the same time as the Gnostic texts are, and they're referring to traditions that were thought to have been arrived at like the Library of Alexandria, which was burned down. So these schools of Alexandria, in which like influence from ancient Egypt and the Zoroastrians and Babylon were sort of being collected and studied by Jewish mystics at the time of, right before Christ. And so obviously we have our Lord, speaking against the traditions of men. And we have obviously in the Old Testament sacrifices to Baal and to the golden calf and to Molech, and it's hard to really pin down where all these traditions come from, but I think they get codified, we can safely say, around the time of the Zohar, and maybe before that with the Sefer Yetzirah, which is most scholars, I think, say it comes from the 9th century, and it was actually, I think, more influential for what became speculative Masonry, Freemasonry, than even the Zohar was, because it speaks about a kind of memorization system based upon the Hebrew letters, which as a kind of imaginative way, a speculative way of rebuilding the temple in the mind. And so, operative Masons were trained within their guilds in this Sefer Yetzirah technique, prior to even, 1717, when there were still operative, lodges and things like that in Scotland and England and, the medieval ages. So, and then also I think there's an aspect of the Crusades as well. I'm a Roman Catholic, so I'm not anti-Crusades. I'm not anti-Templars, but I do think the Crusaders and the Templars were corrupted somewhere in the process of the Crusades, and they began smuggling back into Europe esoteric texts that they recovered from the Holy Land. So anyway, I don't know if
where we see the origins of the Rosicrucians as well. The early Rosicrucians. We know at least they got some of their symbology from the Templars, the Rose and Cross, which I find one of this is kind of a side note, but one of the criticisms that I've read from Lutherans was that Luther could not have adopted the Rose and Cross from the Rosicrucians because the Rosicrucian order wasn't established until after he died, which is a really silly argument because, as you know, just by any exposure to this kind of research, that these secret societies are often not established officially for sometimes centuries after they had already been doing their work. And that's the case with the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, before the Rosicrucian manifestos were written, hundreds of years prior to that, they had already been spreading their secret societies. So, it's just kind of a silly argument to say that, like, oh, well, just at the moment that they established this society, that's when they developed all their symbology and everything. But, and that's something I think that's important to keep in mind, is that, that's why it's very difficult to kind of pin down when some of these revolutionary movements really began, because it's all just a gradual evolution of these movements throughout history. So to even talk about like the origin of Kabbalah, it's very difficult to pin down like a certain date. As you said, I think that's very accurate. It's essentially just Jewish Gnosticism. So, I mean, you could even just say that it dates back to their Babylonian captivity. It's some of the magic that they brought back with them out of, along with the Talmud, out of their Babylonian captivity. You can argue that this all started at the Garden of Eden with the eating of the forbidden fruit, which is, esoteric knowledge, essentially. And so that's another interesting aspect that I get into in the second part of my article, is that along with the kind of human effort to repair the world and the expelling of God, the humans expelling God from the garden, they literally believe that the way back to restoring that unity with God is through this perpetual gnosis. So it's like it's perpetually eating the forbidden fruit, like to gain enough knowledge to restore humanity back to their original state. So it's total inversion of Christianity. Sorry, one thing I want to get back to kind of some of the questions that I had for you. Because we're talking about now how did this get involved in Christendom? How did these Jewish mystical texts get into the hands of these professing Christians? Some of them, some of them kind of excommunicated Catholics. In many cases, that in the early instances during the Renaissance, that's the case. And so you have this kind of like, they naturally become this type of Protestant, and I know that Protestants might disagree with calling them that, but I mean, these were just independent kind of biblical scholars, right? So you have this kind of two different approaches. As you mentioned earlier, there's the Prisca Theologia, which is, you're looking back to the most ancient theology is the most true. That is the presupposition of Renaissance Prisca Theologia. And then on the other hand, you had this was the case in many of the proto-Protestant movements, like the Hussites, this Christian Hebraism, which was more looking at, not so much, as far as I understand, not so much Kabbalah and these mystical texts, but more so just looking to the rabbinical traditions to try to frame Christianity in a Jewish lens to, mass convert the Jews. Still kind of this Kabbalistic concept of like hastening the Messianic age through these mass conversions. So do you see that there's like a real difference in the implementation once it got into the more of like the millenarian movements of the 17th century and the Puritans?
You mean in the sense of like how Christian Hebraism became more prevalent at the time of that of the time of millenarianism, or was it? I'm sorry. Can you?
I'm asking, like, as far as those two different approaches, do you see them being implemented differently? Or do you see it as kind of like they're both contributing to this kind of Kabbalistic aim of restoring the Messianic age?
Sure. And I think another facet here that's important to recognize is that with Christian Hebraism, with Christian Kabbalism, and with even back to the Gnostics, there's always this element of the Marano, and it's a kind of unknown within the historical record, and it doesn't really, until the Inquisition, start to become known and documented, like whether or not a figure was a Marano. So when we look at like Jan Hus, it's widely believed that he was actually of Jewish origin. So is he acting in good faith as this sort of reformer or, Christian revolutionary, or is he someone who's sort of subtly introducing Kabbalistic ideas into the fold of Christianity as a sort of Jewish agent? We can't know that. We can only speculate, but we can look at sort of the correspondences throughout history in which, like you were just talking about with the Rosicrucians. So at exactly the same moment, within a decade, the Templars are disbanded and expelled from England, and as the Jews are expelled from England as well, like in the late, I think 13th century. And so it's believed that both of them were given safe harbor in Scotland. And so that's where you get like Rosslyn Chapel. And there's this tradition of the Jacobite Jews. So the Scottish kings and the Jacobites, there's a text on this called A Pill for Pork Eaters, about how the Scottish don't eat pork because they're actually secretly Israelites and descendants of the Jews. So there's this sort of intermingling of heretical sects that are expelled from various areas, and Jews who are expelled from various areas who have like a kind of revolutionary motive in their exile. But anyway, and then you'd mentioned something in your notes too about Oliver Cromwell and the readmission of the Jews. It's often believed that it around the time of 1666 and Manasseh ben Israel and Sabbatai Zevi and this sort of apocalyptic moment. But actually, in the Restoration era, I guess it was Charles II who followed Oliver Cromwell, who was actually responsible for readmitting the Jews. And prior to Oliver Cromwell, Charles I, the one who was regicided, was actually a Freemason and a Kabbalist, and before him, James I and IV was a Christian Kabbalist as well, king of the King James Bible. So it doesn't fit neatly into, especially in that case, like, monarchist versus, Republican or parliamentarian or whatever, that one is Mason and Judaized and the other is not. There's this kind of Judaization of the Scottish kings, which is a really important aspect of that story. But to go back to what you're saying about Christian Hebraism and Christian millenarianism and Christian Kabbalism and the Rosicrucian circles of like the Hartlib Society. There's, like if you look at, for instance, just New Atlantis, right? It seems to sort of straddle both sides of this because you have Ben Salim, it's like a reformulation of the city of Jerusalem as, the city of the New Atlantis. And there's a Jew named Jacobin, funny enough, who's the prominent like sort of court Kabbalist of New Atlantis, who teaches like the ancient wisdom to all the inhabitants of the New Atlantis there. So it's presented as like a kind of scientific utopia in which like universal knowledge, I think it's Comenius calls this the universal reformation. So it's not just the restoration of the Jews to the Holy Land. It's not just the Jews mass converting to Christianity, but it's actually the whole world and the whole cosmos through the science, through technology, through rediscovering the Prisca Theologia, the ancient wisdom of like the prelapsarian world, that the world is prepared for the return of the Messiah. So it has an esoteric face and it has an exoteric face. It has a scientific face. It has a millenarian Puritan face. And I think the two sort of influence various, or attack Christianity from different vectors so that it can sort of, walk toward this. You can see it with like the influence of Masonry, right? There's ecclesiastical Masonry in which it influences the church, and then there's like Masonry in the sciences and the scientific institutions as well. But they're sort of working toward a similar aim. But really, like its image of what that final utopian messianic society is to look like, the only thing that they can really decide upon is it's man is his own God, and the Christendom of the old world has been abolished. That's the only thing that really defines it.